we're a lot closer. Okay, if everybody can see something that's not other people, I'm going to call that a win and move on from there.
You got it.
Here.
And we're going to find out.
Oh, that works. Okay. Woohoo! 1 out of 2.
Okay, so welcome to the Middle Ages. It is all about Jews living together and living apart from their Muslim and Christian neighbors, right? But to fully appreciate what's going on, I think we need to sort of step out and back for a second and just explore a little bit the idea of a Jewish diaspora. The Jewish diaspora really begins even well before the destruction of the temple in 586, which is the destruction of the first temple. You have Jews that are already established in both Babylonia and Egypt, in part because of previous attempts by the Assyrians to conquer the land, which motivated some Jews to migrate southward to Egypt. And before the destruction of the temple, the Babylonians had already conquered the land and exiled much of the elite leadership to Babylonia, who began to establish a community so that when the rest of the Jews that were exiled arrived, they were not alone. One of the realities of the diaspora community is that it brings Jews into an encounter with a variety of other cultures, and it forces them to develop methodologies for maintaining their identity and sense of community wherever they end up. And what we will discover as we explore the Jewish diaspora is that there are times when the Jews are embraced in their new communities. There are times when they are rejected by their new communities. And what we discover is most of the time, the Jews don't have to go anywhere different in order to have those diverse experiences. One of the things that we are coming out of is what we talked about last time, which was Judaism under Roman hegemony. That, you know, at the end of the Maccabean period in the year 67 before the Common Era, 63 before the Common Era, Rome conquers what is the land of Israel and the kingdom of Judea, and poof, they're now under Roman rule. The upside is that the Romans recognized Judaism as one of the official religions of the Roman Empire, thus making Jews welcome in parts of the empire, or in all parts of the empire, which, as you may have remember, is huge. You know, one of the things about all of these empires is that when A conquers B, they end up with huge expanses of land. The Roman Empire, in some ways, is smaller than the Babylonian and the Persian and the Medes, only because it splinters into 3 parts. The Ptolemaic part that's based in Egypt, the Seleucid part that's based in Syria, and the third part, which is based in Greece. So overall, it's still huge, but it's segmented. The other thing is that in many ways, the Jews who continue to live in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, are in many ways not different from the diaspora communities outside the land of Israel, because they're not living under their own authority. So because the Romans recognized Judaism as a legitimate expression, Jews living in the land of Israel could still express themselves Jewishly, but not in any way that was radically different from the Jews anywhere else in the Roman Empire. They had both all of the same rights and all of the same limitations.
One question, territorially. You
Yes,
say there's Israel, but then there's the land of Judea. Is that one and the same?
smaller. So Judea is what had been the southern kingdom after the split. And it is that area that is essentially the tribe of Judah, with a little bit of Shimon thrown in and a bunch of Levites and Kohanim thrown in, that was based around the Temple Mount. And part of what we saw, just to refresh, was that Jews were influenced by the societies and cultures in which they lived. So, for example, Jews, when they held their meals, when living under the Roman Empire, took their meals in a Roman fashion by reclining on couches and having a dessert course called an epikomus. All right, all of this should resonate somewhat because that's why we lean to the left on Pesach, which works great if you're on a triclinium, not so great if you're in a normal chair. Anything? One of the interesting phenomena is we have the transference of authority from a Jewish community in the land of Israel, which is shrunk by dint of conquest and exile and conquest and exile, and the ascendancy of more open societies. So, for example, compare, if you will, the Jewish community of the early part of the 20th century compared to the Jewish community living in the land of Palestine. Right? You had nascent kibbutzim, you had little pockets going on, but the Jewish community in America was much stronger and ascendant. The Jewish community in Europe was still stronger and more ascendant. The seats of Jewish scholarship were all in Europe. I remember way back when I was toying might be a little understated, considering doing a doctorate, my languages of study were going to include French, which I already had, and German. Why? Because all of the Jewish scholarship and literature that was written in the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s was all emanating from Germany and France. So there was a community in the land of Israel. There were scholars in the land of Israel, but, okay? And that remains part of the reality throughout. Some historians have some really, really radical ideas about the number of Jews in different places. One historian, whose name I will not mention, suggests that as early as the 1st century of the Common Era, there were over 1 million Jews living in metropolitan Alexandria, Egypt.
Oh,
Yeah. And the reason I'm not mentioning his name is because that's probably ridiculous. So I don't want to embarrass him. Now, the reality is, did Alexandria have a solid, well-developed Jewish community? Yes. Was Alexandria that part of the Hellenistic world that helped create the Septuagint, the translation of the Torah and the rest of the Bible into Greek? Yes. Were there lots of Jews living there? Yes. Were there a million of them? Yeah, probably not. Okay. But the Jewish community in North Africa and in Egypt continues deep into the Middle Ages. And in fact, one of the treasures of the Middle Ages, which we can study in a different class, is the Cairo Geniza. The Cairo Geniza, a Geniza is a hiding place or a storehouse. And a Geniza was a repository for documents and texts that were no longer usable. The problem, well, not the problem, it's a problem in that it fills up Geniza. The benefit is that it gives us huge amounts of historical information. So the Cairo Geniza has or disgorged all sorts of documents from centuries through the Middle Ages, bills of divorce, marriage contracts, ketubot, business contracts. There's poetry, there's short stories, there are letters that people wrote. As happens today, there's this confusion between it's written in Hebrew and it has to go in the Geniza. So it is not uncommon for people today to drop off a large box of things at the synagogue, thinking that it needs to go into the Geniza for burial. And once it's sifted, it's like, oh, those 3 books have to go in the Geniza, the rest of it can just be recycled. Being in Hebrew is not what determines, but as many people were uncertain, into the Geniza. And so therefore we got to know a whole lot about the Jewish community of Egypt and beyond through all the documents. In fact, one of the letters that was found in the Geniza is actually a document signed, that, well, I'll show you a picture of it later, was signed by Moses Maimonides. Okay. Okay. Because Jews were allowed rights and privileges, they sort of followed much of the patterns of the Roman Empire. And you had Jews who were brought originally as prisoners after the rebellion in the 1st century CE. But when they were freed, many of them went to southern Italy, to Sicily, became merchants and engaged in commerce because of sea-based trading routes. Right? This is going to establish a pattern that persists through the Middle Ages, where Jews in Italy are importing and exporting goods from Jews in Alexandria and Jews in other parts of the Mediterranean basin. And as we're going to see during the Spanish era and certain other periods, their ability to communicate makes them valuable commodities. And they are the lubricant of trade and traffic. The other phenomenon is that as Roman soldiers are going hither and yon, you have Jews that are following the pathways of the soldiers in order to provide them with provisions and to bring provisions to the settlements that the soldiers are creating as they move northward through Europe. Again, this creates all sorts of trade routes and patterns that can now be maximalized because, oh, Chaim will call his cousin Yankel, name never Yankel, but down in Italy and say, I need, and all of a sudden the trades are facilitated. Jews are also moving into the Iberian Peninsula of areas of Spain and Portugal, and that the integration of Jews into commerce is evident from some of the documents emerging from the church and other historical sources. So, for example, the Fourth Council of Toledo in 633 CE, where the Visigoths are now in control. The Visigoths are German monarchs who converted to Catholicism in the late part of the 6th century. And they decree in 633 that Jews should be prohibited from purchasing Christian slaves, and that they should be forced to let any Christian slaves they already owned go free. All right. I'm going to ignore any of the anti-Semitic overtones, because if we pause on those, we'll be stuck here forever and ever, because they are rampant throughout the Middle Ages. But what the document shows is the standing status and affluence of the Jewish community, who were in fact able to purchase and or already owned slaves. Okay? I'm also ignoring the whole question of owning slaves for the moment, but it shows where Jews were in Toledo in the early part of the 7th century. It also means that when the Muslims begin to conquer the Near East, or parts of it, in the 7th century, who are they tripping over when they get to Spain and Portugal and parts of North Africa? They're Jews. There are Jews everywhere. And not only are they around the Mediterranean basin, but they're all along the trade routes as far flung as India and Afghanistan and China and up into the Carpathian Mountains. And they are also benefiting from the fact that for major parts of this early period, they are able to move between the Christian and Muslim worlds, which Christians and Muslims could not do. You know, Christians didn't want Muslims in their territory, and Muslims didn't want Christians in their territory, particularly since they were at war with each other often once the Muslims come onto the stage. But, well, we'll tolerate the Jews, and we'll tolerate the Jews, and I guess we'll tolerate them going back and forth, because Jews is Jews is Jews. We don't care. One of the other things that I'll just highlight is that there seems to be evidence from certain Talmudic texts that the role of women was more expansive in the Talmudic period under the Romans, and only comes to be more increasingly restricted over time. If you look at any number of issues, you discover that rights and privileges that previously existed suddenly start to disappear. So take something kind of limited. May a woman read the Megillah in public, for the public? and even more narrowly, for other women. It goes from, of course, to, you must be out of your mind. But part of what we're seeing is a narrowing, both within the, eventually in the Christian world and in the Muslim world, of the rights and privileges of women. This takes many centuries. So I just oversimplified a whole lot, but the phenomenology can be traced in each of the three religious communities because they're all culturally interacting with each other and playing off each other in some ways. Okay.
So the Jews restricted the Jews.
Yes.
Of the women rather.
Yes.
Okay.
But part of it is they're feeling the vibe in the world around them. And you could argue that the same thing happens in the other direction, in that, why do Jews in the 1950s start to really push for greater participation and inclusion of women in ritual and in Jewish learning?
Not in all branches.
Actually, in more than we might think, but part of it is a reflection of the fact that that's kind of what's developing in society as a whole. So you go back to the late 1900s, and you had some very, very traditional authorities who are saying we need to provide women with a basic Jewish education because in modernity, they are confronted with things and they need to know both how to respond, whether it's internally to these questions or even externally. So we have some very traditional voices are saying we need to provide women with education that we had previously excluded them from. Also, what's one of the major things that has changed from pre-war to post-war? I'll give you a clue.
Which war?
World War II, sorry.
Women had to work in industry because the men were off to war.
Yes, yes, Rosie the Riveter, right? And, you know, it was, we pulled them into all of this stuff. It was not so simple to push them back out again. And that cauldron of stuff was overflowing into religious communities as well, and into the Jewish world as well.
So when is the different reform, the conservative, the Orthodox, the Hasidic, and when is all that,
That is next week.
next week? All right.
Sorry.
Not a problem.
Okay, but I did want to just highlight that a little bit. Okay, so as I noted, Islam bursts onto the scene in the early 7th century. Muhammad is born somewhere around 571 before the Common Era, so he's becoming an adult in the early 7th century. He is becoming a popular and well-respected teacher. And it seems that he travels a lot with caravans that are going through Arabia and Syria and Egypt and up into Persia. And he is influenced by monks in Syria, by Jewish and Christian merchants and others that he encounters. And they introduce him to this idea of monotheism. The idea that there's one God who created the heavens and the earth, who revealed a moral code of conduct to human beings and punished those who betrayed that. Okay. this idea begins to develop currency in Arabia, and Muhammad becomes the most successful preacher of this new doctrine, right? And he talks about how God, Allah, through the angel Gabriel, has revealed the truest version of the message of monotheism to him alone. And he introduces this new religion, Islam, which means submission to the will of God, but which also shares a Semitic root with the Hebrew word shalom, salam, Islam. It's all part of a package. And so Muhammad begins his conquest small, town by town, community by community. And by the year 622, many of the pagan town elders in Arabia that he encountered had converted to Islam. They invite Muhammad to become their chief magistrate, and he uses this position to promulgate and spread his idea and his doctrine. And he collects or begins to collect these revelations from God through Gabriel to him in a book that is called the Quran. In the year 624, Muhammad now has a large armed force of people who believe, and he has a plan to spread Islam throughout the region. He attacks the city of Mecca, and then groups that are opposed to him in Medina. Right? He assassinates two pagan poets who had written some verses of poetry mocking him. And yes, if this sounds like Salman Rushdie, yeah, to quote an old phrase, la plus ça change, la plus ça reste la même chose. The more things change, the more they remain the same. He defeats the city of Medina, which includes several Jewish groups that live there, one of whom is defeated and one of whom runs away rather than surrender to Muhammad. And they go to a nearby Jewish town called Khaybar, which doesn't last so long because he eventually will attack that. And in the process of conquering that community, beheads hundreds of Jewish men in the marketplace and behaves in a less than nice manner. Right?
So he's only picking on the Jews?
Well, he's conquering the Arabs. He's getting rid of the Jews. And basically, you're given a choice: convert to Islam, and everything's okay, or you had to then you could either face exile, enslavement, or death. Right? However, officially, Islam would consider non-Muslim monotheists, read Jews and Christians, to be people of the book and of higher status than pagans, and they come to be known as dhimmis, or protected people. And as long as they paid compensation, whether in the form of produce or other goods, things were okay. And in fact, the Quran encourages Muslims to fight against dhimmis until they pay the compensation and have been humbled. Right? How do you demonstrate you've been humbled? By paying the compensation. This sort of ebbs and flows, and very much depends on which branch or group is in charge in Islam in any given area. So the Pact of Umar which is created in the middle of the 7th century, becomes sort of the Islamic operating system, right? And Umar, in his pact, he is the caliph. And in 661, he writes a writ of protection for all Muslim rulers regarding minority, non-Muslim, monotheistic communities, Jews, Christians, and eventually Zoroastrians. It's a promise of protection as long as they do those things that I mentioned earlier and act in a way befitting a subordinate population. So this Pact of Umar actually remains in force in some fashion in most Muslim countries until various points in the 19th century. It was so we're talking Ottoman Empire, but that's also next week. The Umayyads transformed the Arab world into less of a religious state and more of a secular one, and begin to foster an uptick in learning and in generalized learning, such that you have the development of a Jewish language wherein Arabic is written in Hebrew characters, and this Judeo-Arabic becomes a predominant language of Jews in that region surrounding Syria, through most of Syria and Iraq, what is now Iraq. Jews are elevated to a Jewish merchant class called Radhanites. They travel the world. They bring news back and forth between happenings in Europe and the Muslim world. And these multilingual Jews are active in affairs of state. These same Umayyads formally allow Jews to take up residence in Jerusalem, something that had been forbidden to them under the Byzantines. And all of a sudden, you have Jews in large number, both emerging and at the same time moving to Jerusalem. And there are stories describing pilgrimage festivals that were now allowed to happen again, and how during Sukkot, you had Jews coming from all over the Middle East to Jerusalem. During the Umayyad period and the
Excuse me,
Abbasid
Rabbi?
period. Yes,
Question.
yes,
This is in the 6th, 7th, 8th century in the
yes,
common. There's no temple to do sacrifice.
correct.
So what are they doing for these festivals?
My guess, and this is purely a guess, is they are preserving the idea of pilgrimage, even though the ultimate purpose of it is not viable anymore. So my guess is they would march around with lulav and etrog the way they had during the temple period. They would do a version of the water ceremony, which they had done in the temple, but now did a version of it, or at least read it in a way that we still do.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Right. One of the other important things that happens during the Umayyad period and the Abbasid period that follows is because they have, to some degree, muted the religious aspect of the state in favor of a more secular, open one, certain ideas begin to find their way in. Specifically, you have a lot of Greek culture, Greek thought, and science permeating into the Arab world, and you have both Arabs and, through this Judeo-Arabic, Jews who are studying Greek philosophy again. Right? The rabbis of the first couple of centuries encountered Greek philosophy because they knew Greek. Now it's coming back into vogue as a topic of study amongst Muslims and Jews. So you have Jewish scholars such as Sadia Gaon and Yehuda Halevi and Moses Maimonides, who are studying Greek philosophy and thought and are incorporating it into their thinking. So in Islam and in Judaism, you have what come to be known as neo-Aristotelian thinkers, guys who are sort of in line with Aristotle, but they're sort of the new version. Right? The challenge for Rambam and others who are trying to do this is there are elements of Aristotelianism that are sort of at odds with, little things like the Torah. So he's going to sort of have to navigate his way around that, but it shows the degree to which he's influenced by it, that he doesn't summarily reject it and say, Narishkeit. Okay. Let me take you through a few of these slides just to sort of reinforce what we've been seeing, where we've been going. Okay, so these are areas with Jewish population during the Greek period. Right? We also see roots of dispersion leading up to the Greek world. Okay? So it's not just Egypt and the land of Israel, but you look and you see Sardis and its area. You see little pockets. This is now taking us into a slightly later period. Right? And we see Jewish communities dotting various parts of Europe and down a little bit into Egypt still, and then eastward as far as what is now Iran. Now we're at the year 300 roughly, and you see the displacement all through the Roman Empire. Okay, here's the Holy Roman Empire, right? The difference here is that it has now become a Christian community, which creates a little bit of discomfiture, which is why you suddenly start to see a migration away from Christian communities, right? Look at where all the arrows are sort of going. You're going into Eastern Europe. You're going south through Hungary towards the Ottoman Empire. You're going across the Mediterranean. Okay, France is moving into they're moving through France and early Germany into Spain and Portugal, which are under Islamic control, or they're going through those across to North Africa. Okay, I apologize, this is small. But I will just sort of highlight for you that the left-hand side is the rise of Islam. And you know what? Not worth highlighting. It's too small. Okay. We are now late 9th, 10th century. You can see who's in control where. And now let's talk a little bit about Judaism under the cross, and then we'll come back to Judaism under the crescent.
I don't see the dark green.
I'm sorry?
The dark green, it says that a substantial Jewish population in the Muslim world was dark green, but where is that?
It's Aleppo, Antioch,
Oh, that's the same
Damascus.
color? Okay, I thought
It's
that was a
that,
different
that's that
color.
sort of bluish color.
Oh.
Right?
It's not green, it's bluish. Oh.
Yeah, up over here.
The bluish color is water.
No, actually, I mean, some of it includes water, but most of it does not. It's little snippets along various shores,
The Tyre and Antioch.
sort of in what is now Syria and Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Where you see it, it says Abbasid Caliphate.
Yeah.
Just below that, heading
Yeah.
toward the Persian Gulf. So here you have an interesting phenomenon. The rabbinic response to the destruction of the Second Temple is one that was embedded in our liturgy and persisted in our liturgy well into the 20th century, and in many communities continues. It was the paragraph in the Musaf Amida, for example, that began, Mipnei chata'enu galinu me'artzenu, because of our sins we were exiled from our land, and now we can no longer bring our sacrifices to the temple, which was destroyed because of our malfeasance. Bad on us. Okay? Now, one, the rabbis do not recognize geopolitics, right? Little country with a small army rebels against the Roman Empire, you're gonna get stomped, right? That's a geopolitical statement. The rabbis don't speak geopolitics, even if they understand it, right? Because ultimately everything is divine in origin. If God does not want us to lose, we don't lose, no matter how big the enemy. So the rabbinic response to the destruction of the temple is bad on us. We deserved it because we didn't do what God wanted us to do. Therefore, God withdrew his protection. But connected to that idea is the idea that the Jews are God's chosen people, singled out for a special covenantal arrangement that comes with the promise of the land of Israel and prosperity for the Jewish people. That unique covenant makes it in some ways necessary to take onus and responsibility for bad things that happen. The problem is that when you begin to encounter Christianity, is that in Christendom, all of that was rejected, essentially. The idea was that, yes, the Jews had done all these bad things, therefore, it's not that God punished them, but God replaced them. That's the New Testament. God replaces those recalcitrant, non-listening Jews with the next generation, the new covenantal people, which is us. So, yes, yeah, on one level, it feeds the idea created by the rabbis of we was bad, and they're going like, yes, you was bad, but it's not that the covenant is being acted out by God punishing you, but the covenant still exists, and you're still God's chosen people, and one day you get the keys to the land back. It's no, that's it. Cut off. Within that view, Jews can't have membership in the society because they are bad. They are evil. And they could not attend church or celebrate Christian holy days or festivals. They couldn't participate in anything in the greater society. And because they also disavowed Jesus as the Messiah, local Christians and religious leaders suspected them and often demonized them. As religious outsiders, they were social outsiders because there was no secular community. And so Jews were not only seen as outsiders, but they were often denied residency rights within Christian neighborhoods, prohibited from owning land, denied membership in professional guilds, and were pushed out of more and more professions, leaving only trade and money lending, the latter forbidden to Christians by church law. The problem is you need it in order to maintain a viable financial situation and a modern, quote unquote, economy. Okay. So Jews are both essential and detested. Yes. In 888, a church council in the town of Mainz, which had a sizable Jewish community, set forth rules prohibiting Christians from getting too close to Jews and their negative influence. Why is such a rule enacted? Because Christians and Jews were clearly having a lot of contact with each other. Otherwise, I don't need that legislation. And part of what we're going to see throughout is a tremendous concern on the part of the church to mitigate and minimize interactions between Christians and Jews because we have bad influences on them. Now, on one level, it's a bit of an oddity from our perspective in the sense of we usually think of the concern that we as a Jewish community have of the impact and influence of the surrounding culture. But one of the things that we see throughout the Middle Ages is almost the exact reverse. This is true in some places, but not others. it depends significantly on who the local leadership ultimately is. So, for example, in 1084, Bishop Rudiger, who was the religious and secular leader of the town of Speyer, writes a charter giving residency rights to a group of Jews for the stated purpose of, quote, adding to the city's reputation, its economic health. But he's pretty generous in that when the Jews of the neighboring city of Mainz seek refuge in Speyer after a fire destroys the Jewish quarter, he gives the Jews residential, commercial, and burial rights, now enabling them to settle in the city. And there's an accompanying Hebrew report, quote unquote, written by Jews in which they thank the bishop for his help. About 6 years later, the emperor Henry IV extends these benefits, and we see similar charters shifting the responsibility for ensuring the Jews' well-being from local bishops to the crown. The Jews become the king's people. All right? You're now what are called servi camerae nostrae, or servants of our treasury, and you belong to the emperor, right? In the same way that serfs belong to the feudal lords on whose land they lived. Okay? This proves to be a mixed blessing over time. Yeah.
Rabbi,
Would not be any
I have a
fun.
question here.
Yes.
There's an area on the map, pink, called the Khazar Kingdom with the Jewish dynasty. I'm not familiar with that part of history at all.
Okay. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to answer your question. But Yehuda Halevi, who is a rabbi, a philosopher, a poet, who's living in Spain during the, quote, golden age of Spain, writes a philosophical work called the Kuzari. In the Kuzari, he sets up this sort of fiction in which a rabbi, a priest, and an imam walk into a bar. And they have, actually, they are invited to a discussion about their various religious traditions by the king of the Khazars. And I have to say that it really, as a compliment to Yehuda Halevi, he presents Christianity and Islam in relatively positive ways, but in the end, the king of the Khazars is convinced by the Jewish voice, and his entire kingdom converts to Judaism. So that is how the kingdom of the Khazars comes into being as a Jewish kingdom. It lasts for a couple of centuries and then kind of is swallowed up by the surrounding Christian world. So at this point, things seem like they're relatively okay. But in 1086, Pope Urban II gathers the first of the three crusades. Right? And you have this mob, essentially, that marches through parts of Europe with a mission to overthrow the Muslims who are in parts of Europe and especially in the Holy Land. And they decide that, once we're busy attacking the infidels, we may as well take care of the local infidels, namely the Jews. The response on a local level was remarkably varied. Right? There were those who made a concerted effort to aid and protect the Jews who were ostensibly under their protection because they're the king's possession. So you don't let people mess with the king's stuff. To other places where they kind of just said, please, we'll just get out of your way. Right? The bishop who succeeds Bishop Rudiger, Bishop John in Speyer, protects the Jews from these marauding mobs of crusaders and really saves the overwhelming majority of Jews in the community. And when some of the local leaders and burghers attempt to round up Jewish inhabitants or to funnel them into the synagogue to make them easy prey, he comes to their rescue, gathers his own forces, and ends up putting the burghers and others who were leading the attack against the Jews in prison. And in fact, he ends up sheltering a large number of Jews in his own rather extensive home until tranquility can be restored. That said, both Latin and Hebrew records show that the Crusades resulted in the annihilation of any number of Jewish communities over the years, in Worms and Mainz and other places. And there were both examples of group suicide in order to avoid either conquest or the forced conversion of those who were captured. The Middle Ages also brought us a few other fun things. One of those was blood libels. This was a phenomenon in which Jews were accused of murdering a Christian, usually a child, in order to use the child's blood for various secret Jewish rituals, such as making matzah. Often, in one community, they're accused of using it to bake hamantash. And for Purim, it's craziness, but it is something that was accepted as fact in the medieval world, especially amongst the peasantry who were not particularly literate, and by local leaders who used it as an opportunity to find benefit in taking stuff from the Jews. The other idea that was introduced was the idea of host desecration. This one's not nearly as popular. But host desecration referred to the idea that Jews who were opposed to Jesus as the Messiah were accused of torturing the host, the wafer that was used in Catholic communion ceremonies. Right? Remember that for Christian faithful, the belief is that the wafer is transformed into the actual body of Christ and is consecrated and is therefore capable of feeling pain. So damaging, destroying the wafer was an essentially attack on Jesus as Christ. And because Jews were known to be rejectors of Jesus as the Messiah, they therefore would have no qualms about doing in the present to the wafer what they had done to Jesus in his own lifetime, which was to hand him over for torture and death.
What's that called again?
Oh,
Post desecration. Isn't that special? So the other phenomenon that we see often in the Middle Ages, next, I apologize, it got a little fuzzy when I made it bigger, but expulsion, all right? The need to placate local Christian officials was often at odds with the monarch's bigger picture about ensuring the economic health of the state that he presided over, and was part of why he had brought Jews into the community or under his protection, right? They performed an important financial function. They were the permitted lenders of money at interest. They enabled banking and finance throughout the continent, and a large portion of trade that was facilitated both by their connections in various places through other Jews, and when not through other Jews, by their multilingual ability. So on the one hand, the king wants to keep them. On the other hand, you have people who are antagonistic to Jews because they are the money lenders. They are the usurers. They're taking our money. Yes, of course they're taking our money, but only because we're repaying a loan and there's interest on it, but they're taking our money, and therefore they demand their expulsion. And Jews are thrown out of a great many places, as you can see from the map. And what is intriguing is that if you look, you'll see that there are many countries that list multiple departure dates, because part of what happens in between is they're invited back because they serve that essential financial necessity. So when the Jews of England were expelled in 1290, they went in large numbers to France and Holland. The Jews of France, or the central part, were expelled in 1306, and they went to Spain and Provence.
Yeah.
When the Provençal Jewish communities were expelled in 1394, many go east to northern Italy, and so on and so on and so on.
So we had a speaker come to CNU who talked about Jews being money lenders, and she, I guess, discredited that, saying that Jews had no money, so that they couldn't be money lenders. Remember that?
No, what she said was that there were more than just Jews. It's just the church felt like the Christians shouldn't charge too much, and so that's
Yeah, but how much money you have is also a relative statement. Plus, I don't need to have a lot in order to lend you a little. But whatever I'm lending you, I'm making a profit on. You may not like that. You may like the fact that I'm lending you money, but you gave me $10, here's $10. No, I don't want to give you $12. And it also seems fairly clear from all of the various things that if Jews didn't have huge affluence, they had resources, enough to make them essential in this process. Okay, I'm going to say a very brief word about the fact that in any society in which Jews find themselves, it is not uncommon for them to have engagements on different strata, such that rabbis and priests in the Middle Ages often engaged in constructive scriptural study and influenced one another. Why? Because they spoke the same language, right? They're all interpreting scripture. They're all trying to make sense out of this sacred text, which they all agree is sacred text. Right? The fact that the Christians saw it as, or elements of it as superseded by the New Testament, it didn't change the fact that this was divine text. And so you see a lot of engagement on that level. I thought very little of this until I was in my congregation in New Jersey, when we had a rather remarkably diverse clergy association, wherein we talked about all sorts of things. And you've got the Jewish guy, and you've got the Muslim guy, and you got a whole panoply of Christians, and you have some non-Abrahamic faiths represented. And part of what we realized was that for as much as there's this great engagement on this stratum of religious leaders, our congregants don't really interact or engage with each other in a significant way. I mean, they engage with each other in the secular world to the degree they needed to, but they didn't really engage. And it led to the creation of some very fascinating projects and programs. But as we're doing it, I'm going like, this is what those scholars who talk about the engagement amongst priests and rabbis in the Middle Ages are talking about. Because I'm now living this phenomenon of engagement at this level, even as though probably not as extreme as it was in the Middle Ages, the populations very much lived in their own silos. Okay, before we leave this part of Christian world, and we're running out of time, I want to say a word about women's participation in medieval synagogues in the Christian world. As I alluded to earlier, the ideas about women seemed to change a little bit over time. And it's very likely that the Christian notion that contact between the sexes leads to sin may have influenced the Jewish world as well. We see certain things transferring over, including increased stringencies in Jewish law prohibiting women from engaging in many mitzvot that were essential to men's Jewish life and identified now almost exclusively as male prerogatives. Right? That said, there's clearly evidence of women engaging in certain things. So, for example, we haven't gotten to talk about him yet, but we'll talk about him. I don't know when we're going to talk about him. But Rashi has no sons, but 3 daughters who often assisted their father in matters of law, were learned in Judaism, and were said to have put on tefillin, which became an exclusively male domain until somewhere late in the 20th century. We also have examples such as a woman named Urania, who is the daughter of a Rabbi Abraham, who is praised for her work as the cantor of the women in a synagogue in Worms. Right? Now, granted, she is leading a community of women, but not only is she leading a community of women, she's recognized and praised for having done so. All right? And there are others who are described as reciting prayers for women in the synagogue. And there's one who is commended for standing every Yom Kippur to sing. What's not clear is whether she's singing for women only or for the whole community. We have all sorts of examples of women writing prayers and liturgical poems called tchinot. Tchinot were poems and prayers written for women by women, dealing with the issues that women struggled with.
So where are these found today?
There's a whole literature of these that have been translated from Hebrew and Yiddish into English. Yeah, if we don't have one in here, I have a volume on my shelf that I could share with you. But not only does it show the creation of this by women, but it shows that there are enough Jewish women who are literate enough to read all of these works, right? My grandmother, Aleh Shalom, had a couple of these volumes. You know, she had a machzor that was Hebrew and Yiddish. And below the, so below the line, it was a Yiddish translation. And it would incorporate some of these tchinot that would be appropriate for a woman to say on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. And she had this other volume that she would just use. This was in lieu of her Siddur. But you only create these and publish these if there's enough people to actually read them, which speaks to a level of literacy amongst Jewish women that was very much not the norm amongst women in that era when these are being created. We often talk about Jewish literacy amongst men, but here we're getting a glimpse into Jewish literacy amongst women. I'm trying to think of how best to proceed. I'm going to skip that part for now, and we're going to go to this bit of history. Got that other part in the next. Okay. I want to park Christendom over here for a moment, and I want to head back to Spain and Portugal. The Jewish community in Spain is relatively ancient. It was highly cultured and literate, and Jews, along with their Muslim and Christian and pagan neighbors, cooperated in business endeavors and in scholarship. Jews have probably lived in Spain since the 3rd century of the Common Era, possibly earlier. But one of the things that we know is that the very fledgling nascent Catholic Church at the Council of Elvira around the year 300 in Granada in the southern part of Spain issues a proclamation in which Christians are admonished not to suffer the fruits which they receive from God with the giving of thanks to be blessed by the Jews. Okay? Clearly, there was at least this idea that these Christian and pagan neighbors believed that Jews' blessings over their food would help their harvest. All right. Whether we can look at it and go, okay, this is just Narishkeit. Doesn't matter what we think about it. But the fact is that the nascent church is going like, no. We don't want this idea promulgated that Jewish prayer has efficacy. As I noted earlier, the Visigoths, when they convert to Christianity, we're not always so friendly to the Jews. That starts around the 6th century. But we also know that the Muslims will conquer Spain from the south and defeat the Visigoths in the year 711. They refer to the land they had conquered as Andalus, as Al-Andalus or Andalusia, which refers to the part of the Iberian Peninsula that comes under Arab control. And they rule that part, that southern part, until 1492. I remind you of the Umayyads that we spoke about earlier. The Umayyads were particularly tolerant towards Jews and encouraged the participation by Arabs and Jews in the study of the sciences, in literature, and in trade. Skipping a little bit. All right. It was through this study that Jewish intellectuals came to learn medicine, geography, cartography from Arab scientists and mathematicians as they lived together in this very open and cosmopolitan area. Spain in this period is on the cutting edge of all facets of learning. Now, it's important for us to remember that nothing is a constant. Right? Sometimes we have to step back away from what we know of the Arab world today and aspects of its fundamentalism to remember and recognize that it was once and a remarkably flourishing, open society. And that there's strands of that still remain in the Arab world. It's just that we are living increasingly at the moment in an era in which fundamentalism in all forms is proliferating, and that no community or religion is exempt from it. Okay. The Christians by the 12th century are cogitating, going like, we don't like the current situation, and there's a period of reconquista, or Christian reconquest of Spain, and the goal being to reclaim the entirety of the Middle East. The Christian rulers, when they reconquer, tolerate the Jewish community, primarily because of its economic and somewhat political value, performing an important function in the society and continuing to pay taxes and fill administrative roles. Right? They're, as they were in the northern parts, they are property of the king, who gave special charters granting them protective status most of the time. You've probably, I got 3 minutes, okay. You've probably heard the characterization of the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries in Spain as a golden age. And like with most things, it is both true and false. It is an oversimplification. It is true that the period is characterized by an openness to a multitude of ideas, both Jewish and secular, but it also comes with the price of being completely dependent on the whim of whoever is in power and authority at the time for that status. Okay. I'm not even going to attempt to do all of this in 3 minutes. I am just going to highlight one thing. One of the characteristics, well, two things. One of the characteristics of the Middle Ages, once the church comes into power, especially in Spain, is Judaism is put on trial. Public debates are created in which Jews must debate the merits of Judaism versus Christianity without saying anything negative about Christianity. So it's a very problematic situation. And one of the most famous of these disputations involves Ramban, Nachmanides. And he is forced into one of these debates, and this goes on for a number of days. And there are different versions of how it ended. In one version, Ramban, before this thing ends, runs away.
Because he didn't want to debate?
Because he didn't want to get to the outcome. In another, he is invited to leave because he's winning. By most accounts, in both what limited literature there is, the idea is that he is winning, and they don't want, so the authorities sort of put an end to it, and they say, you know what, you should probably, you want to go to Israel anyway, geh gesund, have a nice trip. Whichever version of that ending is true, the reality is that Nachmanides does in fact leave Spain for the land of Israel, where he arrives in 1267 and dies about 3 years later. His opponent was a fellow named Pablo Cristiani, right, who was a convert to Catholicism, leaving the Jewish community behind, and being so happy at losing the debate, convinces Pope Clement IV to censor and burn Jewish books, suggesting that they say negative things about Jesus. The reality is that the rabbis don't really talk about Jesus very much, but why let facts get in the way? Christianity also takes his case to King Louis IX in Paris and convinces King Louis to institute the Jewish badge, a badge that Jews had to wear, a measure that monarchs all over Europe began to emulate. Yes, that does sound eerily, creepily familiar. Okay. The only other thing I'm going to say about Spain for the moment is, oh, remember I promised you, all right, so that's a letter written by Maimonides with his signature.
So Hebrew letters,
But Arabic words
Okay.
in here. Right? So here we have Yehuda Halevi, right? Living in Spain in the golden age of Spain. Right? And this is what he writes. Libi b'mizrach v'ani b'sof ma'arav. My heart is in the east, meaning Israel, and I am in the uttermost west. Remember, Spain is about as far west as you can go without falling off the end of the continent. In fact, there used to be a sign apparently at the tip of Portugal that read "ne plus ultra," which means nothing more beyond. And after Columbus, they changed it to plus ultra, more beyond. Right? But what he says, how can I find savor in food? How shall it be sweet to me? How shall I render my vows and my bonds while yet Zion lieth beneath the fetter of Edom and I in Arab chains? Does this sound like a guy who's happy? Does this sound like a guy who's living in a golden age? A light thing it would seem to me to leave all the good things of Spain, seeing how precious in my eyes to behold the dust of the desolate sanctuary. The golden age, as one of my teachers used to say, was not so golden. It was better, but it was never as great as it is made out to be. In the same way that recently I read an article talking about the end of the golden age for the Jewish community in America. And as I'm reading the article, part of what I'm going like, you seem to have glossed over certain things. How golden was that era when Jews are excluded from communities and from clubs? How golden is it when Jews are disproportionately attacked by, yes, Jews had a disproportionately positive influence in certain things, but it was never nearly as beautiful and as wonderful as this article sort of made it out to be. So, I kind of get him. Okay. We didn't finish the Middle Ages, but that's as far as we're going to get tonight.